Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member, and I, of course, thank the witness for appearing today. Mr. Secretary, in your annual report, you cite some concerns about cybersecurity. Ironically, on yesterday, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations held a hearing on cybersecurity styled a global perspective on cyber threats. One of the things that we took away, or I did, from this hearing is that there appears to be clear and convincing evidence that cyber threats and attacks pose a clear and present danger to our financial system. And I'm pleased to see that you have addressed this and you need additional assistance pursuant to what I'm reading. You indicate that you would like for Congress to provide the financial regulators with the authority to oversee third-party vendors. And I want to concur with you. The witnesses who appeared yesterday all indicated, I believe, that you are at the top of the game, as it were, that you're doing better than most.
I don't take much comfort from that, though.
They didn't say that we have absolute security, and I understand this. My concerns have to do with the need for authority. What would you have us do immediately to give you this authority? I know that it's in broad terms here.
Yeah.
Are there some specifics that you can call to our attention? Thank you. And finally, this. You have indicated that you believe that you should be allowed to coordinate a national plan, as it were, to deal with these responses to cyber threats. And you'd like to coordinate this with law enforcement, Homeland Security, as well as regulators. How far along are we with this concept of your having this opportunity to coordinate a national plan? Thank you for your service, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Chair, for your appearance today. Madam Chair, Dr. King, MLK, reminded us that life is an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever impacts one directly impacts all indirectly. We found this to be eminently true with Lehman and Bear Stearns. The failure of these mega institutions had a direct impact on us, but indirectly, they impacted the global economy, which is integrated to an extent that many of us can't even imagine. Because of the indirect impact that it can have on the United States and other banking institutions around the world. I see some value in this living will for these mega institutions and the lesser institutions as well, simply because when we had the failure in 2008, we had a crisis such that banks were reluctant to lend to each other. And when banks won't lend to each other, you don't have a lot of options left. I mention all of this to you because I'm getting to the $50 billion threshold. You've indicated a willingness to see that threshold lifted, but I believe you've also indicated that you would still prefer to have the opportunity, if necessary, to revisit those that are below the $50 billion threshold so as to ascertain whether or not they may become SIFIs by virtue of their activities. So you mentioned lifting it. I'm not going to ask you to tell me at what point you would go to in terms of lifting, but are you saying to us that you still prefer a trigger of some dollar amount? Currently, we have the $50 billion trigger. If you lift it, do you still want a trigger in there of a dollar amount, or are you amenable to going to a means by which only the activities will determine the SIFI designation? Thank you. Moving quickly to the interest rates, you have a global economy that is weak and by some standards continuing to weaken. how much emphasis do you have to place on the global economy when setting the interest rates within our economy, given what I said about the inescapable network of mutuality? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member, and of course I thank the august body of witnesses who have appeared today. In my years on the committee, I don't think I've seen quite the number of financial stability heads assembled at one time for purposes of questioning. So I thank you for being here. Mr. Woodall, much has been made of the fact that you are the only person on the FSOC with insurance expertise. Incidentally, is that the only area that you claim expertise in? Do you claim expertise in other areas to this extent? So you don't claim expertise in banking, but you are learning about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well. Ms. Yellen, if you'll look over this way. Yes, we're over here. Thank you. And welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
You have acquitted yourself well today. I'm sure this will be one of many visits that you'll have with us, and I look forward to continuing this relationship. We're in our genesis today, but there's much that we can do together. I want to ask go into two areas. The first has to do with how much of the '08 crisis was cyclical as opposed to structural. Because if you apply cyclical remedies to a structural problem, you don't get the desired results. So have you been able to quantify the amount of it that was cyclical as opposed to structural? The theory of expansionary fiscal contraction is one that if you cut government spending, that will stimulate the private sector and create more jobs, more businesses will come into being. Where do you stand on this theory of expansionary fiscal contraction? Do you think we have reached a point where cutting alone
Thank you very much,
is not
Mr. Chairman.
going
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to welcome you back again, Chairman Frank. It was an honor to serve in Congress under your leadership when I was a neophyte. And I must tell you that it's also an honor to serve under the leadership of the Honorable Maxine Waters. You left the committee in capable, competent, and qualified hands. And I believe she is following in the tradition and doing an outstanding job. With reference to several things, we talk about community banks quite a bit, Mr. Frank. And when we talk about community banks in terms of the aid and assistance and the changes necessary to make them effective, we use small banks. But when we start to generate legislation, the size becomes very large. In fact, we've had testimony from at least one or two bankers who've indicated that $30, $40, $50 million is a community bank. Mr. Wilson, we all support what you want in trying to help you. But when we try to get a definition of a community bank, it becomes very difficult when we reach the size of 30, 40, 50 billion dollars, not million dollars, billion dollars. So therein lies a small problem. But for today, let's deal with some other issues. Mr. Frank, I'd like for you, if you would, to come back to the question of a single director as opposed to a commission, because I don't think you had an opportunity to finish your answer, and this is something that we have litigated here at the committee level. Accountability, would you address it for just a moment, please, because there seems to be the notion afoot that the CFPB is totally unaccountable, that it can make rules that cannot be overturned, that they simply have this inordinate amount of power with no restrictions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witness for appearing today. My feelings are ambivalent on this topic of kidnapping for ransoms. It is my understanding that ISIL has received as much as $20 million. I also understand that this undercuts the goal of eliminating their access to funds. if we don't take a strong position on these kidnappings. My feelings are ambivalent because I have a constituent who has a son who is being held captive. We're not sure who's holding her son captive. But I've visited with this mother and father, and I know that they want their son returned home safely. And while I understand that we can't pay ransoms, I've seen the evidence of it. And you're in a tough position. But I want you to do all that you can, please. Please do all that you can to try to get these people who are being held hostage returned home safely. It's a balancing act. It is contrary to what our policy is, and I understand this, but we've got to do everything that we can to prevent these dastards, that's with a D, not a B, to prevent these dastards from performing the dastardly deeds that have been shown worldwide. If you could, please, sir, kindly give some indication as to the balancing act and what we're trying to do to make sure that this mother gets her son returned home safely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Ranking Member, and I thank the Secretary for appearing. Mr. Secretary, I fear that the grand old party, the party of Lincoln, Gettysburg Address, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the face of the earth. The party of Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I fear that the grand old party has lost its way. I am amazed at the number of members of the grand old party who are defending Russian intrusion. The party has lost its way. And I'm concerned about the sanctions that Congress legitimately desires to have imposed. I'm concerned as to whether they're being imposed, especially as it relates to Section 241, which accorded the Secretary, the Treasury, Secretary of State, Director of National Intelligence, to codify a list of these oligarchs, persons who have, by way of corruption, achieved great fortune. And this list was to be used so as to identify them and have certain restrictions imposed upon them. It has been reported that the list was compiled by the appropriate members of the government, the experts, if you will. But it's also been reported that after compilation took place, someone higher up decided that there was a better list that ought to be utilized. There is a suspicion that the person higher up resides in your office. Can you give clarification as to what's going on with the list?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Chair, for appearing today. Madam Chair, I'd like to get some things for the record. These are things that are of common knowledge to a certain extent. It is true that you're a member of FSOC, correct?
Yes.
And as a member of FSOC, you have voting privileges.
Yes.
And as a member of FSOC, which is a newly formed institution as a result of Dodd-Frank, you have the ability to look at the entire financial system, looking for risk that may be out there that can hurt the system. Is that correct?
Yes.
Simple terms. Now, in doing this, Madam Chair, would it be fair to say that if we had had FSOC prior to 2008, we would have been more likely to see the concerns that AIG posed than less likely to see them? Is it fair to say that there's a greater likelihood we would have seen some of these concerns with AIG? Well, this is why I ask in terms of more likely or less likely. More likely to have seen it or less likely?
I mean,
And in reviewing entities such as AIG, which had this London office that was doing some things that we didn't find quite acceptable after the fact, in reviewing these things, do you spend an inordinate amount of time looking at entities that don't come under the $50 billion threshold as a trigger for designation as a SIFI? Do you spend a lot of time before you cast that vote? And do you have an office to help you with research, OFR, to help you with the research, people who provide expertise to the Treasury, and the Treasury can share its, thank you. And when you cast your vote, are you told how to vote? Does someone say to you, you have to vote a certain way on these issues?
no.
Is it your opinion that you've been a pretty independent person serving on this FSOC?
Yes.
And as an independent person, you put your time in and you study things. And you come to final conclusions. Now, I just looked at some of the information on some of the very large companies in this country. A good many of them have triggers that bring them under the auspices of FSOC and the SIFI designation. If you had to study every one of them to ascertain whether or not it should be a SIFI, would it take a lot of time to do this?
No question.
Do you have the personnel such that you could study all of these mega corporations that are 50 billion and above? Do you have the personnel to look at them with the kind of detail that you need if you did not have the trigger to bring some of them under an umbrella? And do you find that it's beneficial to have a trigger, whether it's at 50 billion or some other amount? Is it beneficial to have a trigger? And without that trigger, would you find yourself having to answer a good many more MetLife questions and a good many more questions that relate to entities that you're trying to sift through and ascertain whether or not they're SIFIs? Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.